Now we're going to save some time later for questions. And if you have questions, just hold them for a little while. If they're good questions, I'll take them. I may say I don't know the answer because I don't want to make up an answer. And if they're not good questions, Olga in the back has a big hook. And she's ready to hook you right out. Now, what I want to talk about now is a little about the book itself. A couple of minutes ago, I spoke about my background. Now I want to give about the book. What's in the book? Spirit Lives was a 3-year odyssey I took. I started in June of 2010, and I ended in June of this year, June of 2013. Are you hearing me? Are you hearing me?
No.
Anyway, and it was a wonderful odyssey I've been on. An odyssey that I'm so happy I was writing a book, because I videoed and wrote about everything. In my book, one of the people I have is John of God. Now, John of God is the Brazilian healer. Oprah has had 4 shows about John of God. And the last show, Oprah, went to Brazil and interviewed John of God in person. John of God is the healer who works with 36 physicians who are in spirit. And they give him the direction what to do and what not to do with the patients. And if you don't know John of God, Google John of God. Or go to YouTube and you will see some wonderful examples of what he does. He's been doing this all his life. Also, I was at Martin Rubach's office. Martin, just raise your hands, everybody. I go to Martin 4 times a year when the season changes. He does an acupressure. And I was outside his office, and one of the other people who worked there came up to me and said, "You know, I've watched you come here from Martin for several years, but your aura is gigantic." Now, I thought it was like a come-on line first. But then I realized this woman sees auras. She's in the book. She deals with the angelic realm. I have a section on a shaman who was trained in Peru. The next person is Frank St. James. Frank St. James was recommended to me by a mutual friend of ours who is named Patienta. She said, "You have to meet and interview and put in your book Frank St. James." Frank, would you just raise your hand, please? Thank you. Frank's job is to find missing bodies. So I drive out to Fairfield, where his office and home is, and I was fascinated by what he told me. The spirit of the victim would communicate with Frank and tell him where the body was. So much so that Frank could draw a map and direct the police to where the body was located. Am I right, Frank? Is that pretty much the gist of it? And it was such a fantastic interview. My interviews were about an hour. I wrote, I videoed, and I taped. At the end of this hour, I said, "Frank, nobody's going to believe what you told me." So he said, "Well, what do you want, John?" I said, "I need collaboration." "What kind of collaboration?" "I need one of these police departments with which you worked to collaborate." Without a hesitation, Frank picked up the phone and called up the chief of police in Englewood Cliffs, Michael Cioffi. The chief of police in Englewood Cliffs was more than happy to speak to me. He said to Frank, "Ask Dr. Muciaccia to drive over to my office now. I'll give him an interview." So 30 minutes later, I'm in the office of the chief, and you probably know Englewood Cliffs is an elite community. Not only did Chief Mike Cioffi give me an interview, signed the release form, but he called in his deputy, who had also worked with Frank St. James on some cases, a gentleman by the name of Captain Tinney Reed, who then connected me with Fred Pulisi, who at the time was a detective with Hackensack PD. He also was more than happy. They spoke beautifully about Frank St. James, who wanted to give some kind of solace to the survivors and the family. Never charged a penny for his services. And his results were so accurate. Could you imagine that? Speaking to the spirit of the murder victim so that you could draw a map and lead the police, sometimes miles away. We are going to have questions and answers later. Okay, so if I see on some of your faces you may have questions. I was delighted to have Frank St. James in my book. And I'm so happy that you're here this evening, Frank. Thank you. I have a story in my book of a woman who was struck by lightning. We've heard of these cases. She died for a few minutes, was told she had to come back. She wasn't allowed to physically die. Then I'm on my way, another case, I'm on my way to Boca to interview a healer by the name of Lynn Hambro. So if you go to Boca, you probably know you can't fly into Boca. They don't have an airport. They don't want an airport. So I flew into West Palm. Fly into West Palm, and I had a 7 o'clock appointment with Lynn Hambro in Boca that night. It's 3 o'clock. I find my way into the restaurant in the hotel where I was staying. And since it's 3 o'clock, the manager greeted me, and I said, "May I have a late lunch, early dinner?" She said, "Sure. Sit anywhere you'd like." Well, all the tables were empty, so I had no trouble finding a seat. She said, "Sir, are you here on business or pleasure?" Which I think was a kind of a standard question they would ask the guests at the hotel. It was a very lovely hotel. I said, "I'm here to interview somebody tonight. I'm writing a book." "What kind of a book, sir?" I said, "It's a book on spirit. Spirit Lives is the working title." She said, "Tell me a little bit more." I told her more about it. Her eyes opened up, her mouth opened up. She said, "I have a story to tell you." So I said, "Bring my food over and sit down." There was nobody in the restaurant other than myself. This young lady, the manager of the restaurant in the Four Seasons Hotel, sat with me, told me a fantastic story. The story, at the time of the story, she was 3 years old. And her mother received a dream from the grandfather. And the grandfather had been a physician in the Upper West Side. The dream was, go and check on Erica. The mother got out, rubbed the sleep out of her eyes, gets out of bed, walks down the hall. To go to little 3-year-old Erica's bedroom, the mother had to pass the kitchen. The kitchen was engulfed in flames. So sometimes spirit works through dreams. Sometimes spirit works through feelings. Sometimes feeling works through impressions. I have one person in my book who could smell her grandmother's perfume. Another woman holds her aunt's rosary beads when she needs answers to questions, and gets the answers, and they're accurate answers to her questions. I've divided my book into professionals and ordinary. Ordinary people like us. But I think every one of us is psychic. I think every one of us is a healer. I think every one of us is clairvoyant. We just perhaps haven't recognized it yet. But I think everyone in this room, and if we count the spiritual beings here, there's probably 600 or 700 or 800 of us in this room now. We all have the capacity to heal and to talk about what's about to happen intuitively. One of the people I interviewed, who has a very high-end job in Rockefeller Center, is a voodoo priestess. I met her, but she said, "Before I give you an interview, John, you must see the movie, rent it, The Rainbow and the Serpent." The Rainbow and the Serpent, I think, was filmed in the 70s or 80s. So I got it from Netflix, watched it, and my job was to call Nicole Miller back. She was the voodoo priestess. She said, "John, did you watch the movie?" I said, "Yes." "What did you think?" I said, "It's a lot of sticking pins in dolls." She said, "That's exactly what voodoo is not. That's why I wanted you to watch the movie." I have not only met Nicole Miller, I've not only interviewed her, she's not only in the book, but I've become friends with Nicole Miller. She's a lovely woman. I found out that when she was a teenager, she was Miss Haiti in the Miss Universe contest. A beautiful woman, but beautiful here as well. Then, my friend Carmela sees me in Big Red Tomato, and she says, John, I just met somebody in Fort Lauderdale, a healer, by the name of Red Duke. So John then is on his computer buying a ticket to fly to Fort Lauderdale. And I interviewed this big hunk of a man, Red Duke, who, as big as he was, that's as big as his heart was. His dedication is to help people, and he does spiritual healing. I decided also to mention some things like Ibn Alexander's book, Proof of Heaven. I have mentioned that. I also put a section in that comes from a book written by a scientist. The title of that book is The Afterlife Experiments. And Dr. Gary Schwartz is the gentleman's name. I condensed his book into one of the chapters in my book for the skeptics in the audience. Not this audience, the book or Kindle buying audience. To show them that scientifically, this particular gentleman has shown that something lives on after the physical body dies. And that's something we may call a soul, whatever you want to call it, spirit, but something lives on. And I think you know that there was a university in California that actually weighed bodies and found out that there is a difference in weight while the person is alive and then when the person passes. And they don't attribute it to bodily fluid. So that's an interesting part of my book. Also, I have the so-called ordinary people section. And I have fantastic, fantastic people there. People like us who've had wonderful experiences. You have to look around in your life and realize that lots of times Spirit is working with you or through you. But maybe you say, use that word, it's a coincidence, and you scratch your head. But if you look at the real definition of the word coincidence, it's kind of like a coming together of spirit. But we use it in a different meaning. We think, oh, it's an accident. That's so-called coincidence. I personally know two medical doctors who both are working in the office with the same specialty that their dads had. That's an interesting thing, isn't it? We may call it a coincidence. I don't. I put a couple groups in because around the country, around the world, there are several groups that are spiritual groups. There's one in New York City, and I had the pleasure a couple weeks ago to speak to them, the Spiritualist Church of New York City on East 35th Street. And they meet weekly or bi-monthly to emphasize the fact that Spirit lives. A couple of things I got out of doing the work for this book are this. We are much, much more than we think we are. We're very deep, deep, deep entities. We're deep creatures. We're healers. We're intuitives. We're psychics. Don't underestimate yourself. And I've also gotten this message or lesson, whether you want to accept it or not. We're all one. We're all connected. And I think the sooner we realize that, perhaps the faster we'll stop some of the nonsense that goes on in the world, where we fight each other and have these grudges towards each other. We're connected. So what you do for yourself, you do for other people. What you do for your neighbor, you do for everyone.